Welcome. My name is Kathleen Staton. I'm the manager of Music Constructed, and I'm so happy that you are here with us tonight for Elise's session on the Danielson framework, what that is, how to implement it, and I'll give you the sort of Cliff's Notes version. It's how to make sure that your skill and the time that you put into all of your planning and all of the work with your students is visible. Of course, the students' work is visible through concerts and performances, but is your work visible? Are you valued for all that you're bringing to the table? And Elise is going to help you with that tonight. Elise is based in Chicago. She has an impressive 3 master's degrees across a variety of disciplines, including leadership. She could be a principal, special education, which is a huge area of interest for her. Well, I'll let her tell you all the rest. Sit back and enjoy. Feel free to take yourself off of mute or off of no camera if you would like to get involved. We're happy you're here. So I'll turn it over to you, Elise. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you, Kathleen. I appreciate it. And I want to preface ahead of time that as we were logging in, my screen would just turn robot for a couple minutes, but it hasn't happened yet in the last 15. So we're going to cross our fingers and hope that doesn't happen. As Kathleen said, I'm Elise. I am so excited to be here with you. We're going to be talking about the Danielson framework. And if you are comfortable showing your face, please feel free. If not, I have talked to classrooms of students with their head down all day. So I'm used to either or. Feel free to shout things out. Feel free to just sit back and whatever works best for you. I am going to go ahead and put some slides up so that you can follow along. I am, again, special ed is like one of my main areas. So I love visuals. I love having visual aids. So I would like to see all that if I were at a presentation. So I'm going to do that for you. And I will ask that if you can see my shared screen once it comes up, that you just give me a little either real life thumbs up or a virtual thumbs up with your little fun virtual hands as it's slowly but surely loading. There we go. Perfect. And now it'll be nice and big because now it's in present mode. So usually I have kind of a good idea of coming into our sessions, what everybody's background is. I'm going to ask a question in a minute once we settle in about your experience with the Danielson framework. But first, I want to set us up with our objective because this is really important. We're going to review the domains of the Danielson framework and how it relates to the National Core Arts Standards as we get thinking into, how does Danielson align itself? How do the National Core Arts Standards align themselves? And how can we bring those together? We're going to look at an overview of each domain area as they apply to music teaching and music making. And we're going to look at some tips when it comes to preparing for an evaluation. Hopefully, you'll leave with some knowledge about each domain area as well as talking points for your discussions with administrators. So that's our big objective today. And we'll just do a very, very quick about me because Kathleen did a great job. I'm a music educator and special educator turned administrator. My work really focuses on access and inclusion for all students. That's my jam, and access and inclusion for you. I know as an administrator how often our wonderful music teachers get kind of brushed to the side unless it's concert time. So it's really important, especially as an administrator now, that your voices are heard, that you know how to stand up for yourselves and show yourselves, especially in an area where a lot of our administrators don't have a music background or don't really know what the music standards are, or can read about them but don't really have a picture of what that looks like in their mind. So as much as it's not our job to help them out with that evaluative process, it can be a lot smoother the more that we know. So thinking about the Danielson framework, or framework for teaching as it's now called, by either a show of hands, a show of thumbs up, thumbs down, how familiar are we with the Danielson framework? And if you're pretty familiar, you can give me a thumbs up. If you're like, what are you even talking about? Thumbs down. If you're like, I'm kind of in the middle somewhere, you can give me a middle thumb. You can put it in the chat. I see some people chatting in here. Not familiar? Okay. So let's talk about it a little bit. This is a main evaluative system that not all, but most school districts use to evaluate their teachers. Okay. So almost every evaluative process focuses on these elements. This was coined by Charlotte Danielson. And if you Google framework for teaching, this is also a live link that's right up here in the picture. I'll share that with you at the end of our session tonight. But it's really encompassing of the evaluative systems that our school districts use and our evaluators use. It's like the #1 used in the nation in the United States. And it really has 4 main areas: planning and preparation, learning environments, learning experiences, and principled teaching. So if you were somebody who is a little bit familiar, these have changed a little bit. They've changed into principled teaching and learning experiences versus just instruction. As we know, the culture of the classrooms have changed a lot, especially post-pandemic, where we're focused on those experiences. We're focused on the culture of our classroom and our community. We're not so much focused on, students are doing A, they're writing this one thing. We're really focused on that community piece. So with that, framework for teaching is really relationship based. It's looking at the ways in which we interact with our students, which students interact with each other. It's about planning and improving. It's about supporting and developing relationships, assessing and questioning. We know that's so important to know where our students are at and have them moving forward. Engagement and hands-on experience. Our national core art standards, it's about a unified quality arts education. It's about building connections, responding and evaluating, performing. You might insert interpreting and developing in there, and creating, which is also organizing and refining, right? So really all of these together, they're about consistency, they're about relationships, and they're about continued learning. So as you're having your discussions with your administrator when you're getting evaluated or they're coming into your classroom to kind of ask what's going on, that consistency, that students know what's expected of them, they know what to do in your classroom. You are being consistent in the way that you manage behavior or in the way that you talk to your students. The relationships that you've built, so emphasizing how you relate to your students and how your students relate to each other, as well as the continued learning. Our goal as music educators is rarely ever that students will do something in our classroom and then never do it again, right? Like we're all in music education because we want to have that continued learning. We are continuing to learn. We continue to push ourselves and grow as musicians. We want to see the same in our students. And that's what the Danielson framework really is. It's our continued learning about ourselves as educators. So really these two separate areas align beautifully together with consistency, relationships, and continued learning. The first domain when we think about planning and preparation is really broken up into 6 main areas. There's applying your knowledge of content and pedagogy. This is something that we do every day. We'll dive just a little bit deeper in the next slide. Knowing and valuing students, setting instructional outcomes, using resources effectively, planning coherent instruction, and designing and analyzing assessments. Now, some of these come pretty easily to music educators. We have to apply our content of our pedagogy in our teaching, right? Like we can't teach music without having a background basis of music. We do know and value our students. That's pretty easy to do in an ensemble where everybody has a voice and everybody has a part. Our instructional outcomes, we're giving a performance. Like there has to be an end goal there. Using resources effectively, well, yeah, if we're playing instruments, we're using them effectively. And planning that coherent instruction, how do we get from our point A to our point B? Something that we don't do as much, though, naturally, is designing and analyzing those assessments. And especially from the mindset of an administrator who's used to walking into a science classroom and seeing, oh, they got these 10 questions correct, or walking into a math classroom and knowing concretely that 1 + 1 is 2 and the student can recite that. We all know that to be true. Music isn't the same in that way. There's so much vulnerability, there's so much subjectivity in the ways in which we perform. So it's really our job to help our administrators understand what students are learning by showing student growth, by showing the before and after. And sometimes that's even from having like an informance in the beginning of the year to having a performance when it comes time for the holidays. Sometimes that's having students be able to share knowledge, for example, in like a unit about rock music or a type of music that they're interested in, where before they had no background knowledge and now they can tell somebody all about it, or explaining all of the elements of music that exist in a song. So it's thinking outside of the box of those assessments and how we design those and analyze the ways in which they work for our students. So really that comes down to our thoughtful lesson plans, demonstrating our knowledge of our central concepts and skills, understanding those prerequisite relationships, us being able to say, well, in order for a student to be able to play this sonata on a piano, they had to have all this background music, background knowledge of music. That's really important. Presenting information in comprehensible ways is also important. I know this is something that we talk about often, where if we're talking to parents about something that their student is learning in class and we use musical terms, but they've had no music experience, they might have no idea what I'm saying, right? How many parents walk into a room and see any barred instrument and just assume it's a xylophone? Does that happen to any of you? Because it happens often with my students. So using terms that they might recognize and being able to build that comprehension of, well, it's kind of like a xylophone, and then having the student explain, oh, but it's bigger, so it sounds lower, or it's made of wood, or, just continuing, depending on the grade level, those pieces. And then addressing those preconceptions. And I don't know about any of you, but when I started my first music position, my principal had this conception that music was a class where we play and perform. And yes, that is a piece of the class. We do play and perform and do a million things to get there, right? So it's not just that play and that perform. Yes, and all drums are bongos too. That is something that certainly had been said. We have to address those preconceptions and really let our teachers, our students, our parents, and our principals understand all of the pieces that go into music making. So in the music room, the big questions to think about are, how do we demonstrate what we're doing? Other than physically doing it, how can we show that? How can we plan to demonstrate that knowledge? And then how do we provide access to everyone to be able to gain that knowledge? And these are not questions that I need you to answer right now by any means. These are just questions to think about as we're planning and preparing for our students. When we're going to be great instructors, these are questions to think about. And again, it's understanding those prerequisite relationships, presenting information in comprehensible ways, and then addressing those preconceived notions, those preconceptions. How can we demonstrate what we're doing? How do we demonstrate that we know it? How do we plan to share it? And how do we provide access? That's all in our planning and preparation. And thinking about it from the core art standards, I like to just do a little tie back. Anchored standard 1 is generating and conceptualizing artistic ideas and work. So how can we share that we're conceptualizing these ideas, right? How do we tell somebody that we're doing that? We expect our students to do that. How can we do that for ourselves? Anchored standard 10 is synthesizing and relating knowledge and personal experiences to make art. How can we show our principals or our evaluators that we're relating our prior knowledge and personal experiences with our students' experiences to make art? How can we convey meaning through the presentation of artistic work? We're asking our students to do that. How can we do that in our schools and in our settings? I'm a big proponent, and you'll see in the corner, to my students, I will never ask you to do something I can't do. When they were better at me than playing guitar, I had to learn, because I will never ask them to do something that I can't do. So if we're asking them to engage in and meet these anchor standards, we can do the same for ourselves, just thinking through it in a different way in our planning and preparation. Our second domain is our learning environments. And this used to be called classroom environment, but we know, especially post-COVID, we're not always in classrooms. Sometimes we're on carts, sometimes we're out in a field. It just depends on the day. Sometimes we're teaching in the lunchroom while people are having lunch next door, indoor recess next door. Things happen. So it's our learning environment. And these areas are cultivating respectful and affirming environments, fostering a culture for learning, maintaining a purposeful environment, supporting positive student behavior, and organizing spaces for learning. So our first domain, it's really hard for anybody to see all of that planning and preparation other than like, here's a literal lesson plan, right? This is something that is more visible, right? We can see how to support a positive student behavior environment. We can see an organized space. We can see a culture of respect and affirmation. We can generally see that the environment is purposeful and that there is a culture for learning in the class. This one is a little bit more hands-on. So this is often, I'll be honest with you, when I'm evaluating people, I'm the harshest here. Also because I really care about that culture and that affirming environment, and that's my personal bias. But that is something that I always look for because I can see it. I want to know that when I walk into a room for 2C, I can ask a student what they're supposed to be doing and why it's important, and they can tell me. I always want students to know not only why we're doing this, but why is it important to them. The age-old adage of, well, I'll never use algebra when I'm older, or I'll never need to know this equation when I'm older, so it's not useful. everything that we're doing in the music room is useful. And yeah, sure, maybe you won't be playing the piano when you're older, but if you're learning to read music and you're learning to play in an ensemble and you're learning to practice and you're learning to self-assess, these are skills that you'll use when you're older. And that's why it's important. I want my students to be able to say that. And I want any evaluator walking in the room to be able to do so as well. So those learning environments are really focused on creating a community within the classroom, but I say co-creating because it's not just me creating it as the teacher. It's the students co-creating that community within the classroom. They have a voice and they should be setting the norms. They should be helping me to understand what the culture is going to be in our classroom. We're not in the days of one teacher and students just sit and listen. We are a community. Culturally responsive ways of interaction. That's super important. Respectful teacher to student and student to student interactions, and a clear approach of conflict resolution. This is one that a lot of times, especially having a special ed background, we see a lot of students that will have some sort of behavior or something in the class, and there's no clear conflict resolution. And a lot of times in our schools, we have, let's say, like a safety plan or a restorative plan, or, just lots of different things that we can use with students. But it's also part of our job to make sure that we have that in our learning environment. What happens if XYZ? What happens if a student breaks down in the class? What happens if a student runs out of the room? What happens X, Y, and Z? It's important for us to have those plans. So again, when we think about this, we think, how do we nurture those relationships among students? How do we make it so that our community, our classroom is a community? How do we maintain a positive rapport in times of conflict? Especially when we only see our kids 1 to 2 times a week, even sometimes. How do we maintain that positive relationship? We were talking about this the other day. It takes 5 positives to every 1 negative in order for there to be a positive relationship. This is something I'm working on in my personal life. Having those positives, especially when there's that negative, to even get back to even. We want to start above that, but to even get back to even. How do we create an inclusive learning environment for everybody? So it's that co-creating a community, that teacher to student and student to student, and then culturally responsive elements in our classrooms are super important. And again, tying it back to the core art standards, things that we ask our students to do, we're doing these too as well. So Anchor Standard 3, refine and complete artistic work. How are we refining and completing the work that's in our classroom? How are we refining and completing that community? How are we relating ideas and works with our societal, cultural, and historic context? How are we relating our classroom, our ideas about what we're going to be doing in our lessons and our activities? Interpret intent and meaning in artistic work. How are we interpreting the intent and meaning in our relationships? How are we interpreting the intent of the words that we're using, of the context that we're using, of the space that we have? So keeping those in mind. I would never ask my students to do something that I can't do. How can we tie those in? And then our third domain, again, this one is another one that's pretty visible. This used to be called simply instruction. We know that we are beyond instruction. We are here for learning experiences. So here we have communicating about purpose and content. Again, why are we here? What are we doing? Why is this important? Using questioning and discussion techniques. I shouldn't be telling my students every single thing. I should be asking to gauge an understanding of their knowledge. Engaging students in learning. This is pretty visible when you walk into a room. You can tell who's engaged and who's not engaged. Using assessment for learning and responding flexibly to student needs. And that one is new, responding flexibly to student needs. Because as we know, especially post-pandemic, we have a variety of student needs in our classroom. How do we respond flexibly to those needs? And what does flexibility look like in our classroom? Certainly, there are things that we cannot be flexible about in our classroom, but there also certainly are. So here we're looking for that communication of the purpose. Use of academic language. It's our job to, yes, provide things in comprehensible ways, but then also to tie in that academic language so that our students can talk in that academic language as well. We want our students to be able to explain to our evaluators, here's what I'm doing, here's why it's important, and here's the word for it, right? We want to be able to explain, I'm playing this sonata. Well, what's a sonata? We want them to be able to explain that to our administrators. We want to have those frequent checks for understanding. A lot of times we're working in small groups, especially when we're preparing for concerts, we might be working with a certain section. We want to be able to have those checks for understanding. I know oftentimes when I was working with a choir, we would send them off and to do sectionals, and then I'd go bounce around and see how everybody's doing, and then come back and we work as the group, because we found that it did not work when you had everybody in the room and just the altos would stand up and perform. Everybody else was getting bored. We want to make sure that we have those times for those frequent checks of understanding and that scaffolded knowledge, because not everybody's going to be at the same place. Sorry, there's a dog barking outside my house. Not everybody's going to be in the same place. And we want to make sure that those expectations are known. All students know what they are supposed to be doing. We were talking about this again very recently because a lot of our students cannot succeed unless they know what is being asked of them. That's true to us as well. If we walked into a room and we were told we had to do a job, but we had no idea what the job was and we're handed a stack of paper, how are we supposed to succeed? How are we supposed to know what to do? We have to let them know what the expectations are, and with that, what the outcome is going to be. Then they can be successful. So in the music room, it's that big question of, why is this important? How do students connect to the purpose and the value of learning? And how do they show that they know the expectations? How do they show they know what they're supposed to be doing? I actually was in a classroom the other day with a first year teacher, and she asked one of the students, it was very loud in the room. She goes, "Well, what are you supposed to be doing right now?" And they had no idea what they were supposed to be doing right now. It was not posted anywhere. It was not clear what the directions were in the beginning. How do they show they know the expectations? So is this having them jot down a note of what they're supposed to be doing? Is this repeating it aloud before they go on to do what they're supposed to be doing? In some of our self-contained rooms, again, thinking with the special ed background, is this that they have their visual schedule and they know what's going on because they have that visual in front of them? How do they show they know the expectations? That's vastly important. So again, relating it back to our core art standards, organizing and developing those artistic ideas and work. How are we organizing and developing within our classroom to show what we know to set up our classroom for success? How are we developing and refining those techniques and work for presentation? How are we defining the techniques of what we use to maintain rapport? How are we refining our relationships with our students as things change? Just like we would a piece of art. How are we refining that? Because we change every day. And then how are we applying criteria to evaluate our work? How are we applying criteria to evaluate what our students are doing in our classroom? How are we assessing ourselves and assessing them? And when we think about assessing ourselves, that's really what Domain 4 is, and that principled teaching. So this is really lifelong learning. And this used to be called professional responsibilities because this was things that all professionals did. But truthfully, it's not things that all professionals do. It's things that good teachers do to reflect with themselves. It's engaging in that reflective practice. It's documenting the student progress. And yes, that is in your grade book, but it's even going beyond that. It's engaging families and communities, especially post-COVID. I know I keep coming back to that, but that community engagement is huge. Contributing to the school community and culture. We are one of the few people that usually sees all of the students in our building. We are a central piece to that school community and that culture as music educators. It's so important. How do we grow and develop professionally? You're here. You're already doing 4E. You tell your principal, I did 4E. I went to this PD and I learned about it. And then acting in service of students. And this one can be so hard, especially with some of our tougher students, putting our students and their needs first, knowing what's best for our students and putting that first. If students can't afford an instrument, how do we get it to them? If students can't come to a concert because they don't have transportation, how do we get them there? Acting in service of what's best for the students. So this really comes into that self-assessment of our teaching, questioning our ideals and our beliefs, planning, practicing, and trying new approaches. We can never be perfect, and you could have it down one day and then the next day something's changed, and now we have to plan, practice, and try something new all over again. And then becoming lifelong learners and continuing to grow and continuing to learn. That's what principal teachers do. So the big questions here are, how do we utilize multiple sources in our planning? How do we utilize our students and our community members and our staff members How do we self-reflect? Is that something that's required of you in your position? Do you have a little post-it note that you put on the end of every lesson plan? Do you even make lesson plans? You might not. It might not be required of you. But then how do you know what you're teaching? How do you reflect on that? How do you stay fresh is really the biggest piece there. How do you make sure that you are there for your students and what they're going through now? And I had this realization the other day when I was talking to a student. I used to pride myself on being like a cool teacher who always knew what was going on. I have a younger sibling who is 7 years younger than me. So I was in it. I knew what all the popular trends were. And at the end of last year, I remember saying something to a student. They're like, what is that? Is, from, 2010, early 2010s, we were talking about a song and they're like, oh, that's old. That's really old. You must be really old. And I'm thinking, I am not fresh anymore. I have to continue to become a more principled teacher. But we do, right? We have to hop on the trend wagon and know what's going on. I had to get on TikTok and then I had to get off of TikTok. But just all of these pieces of knowing what is relevant to our students, what is meaningful to our students, that's principled teaching. That's keeping us engaged with what they're doing. That's valuing them as individuals and valuing our community. Staying on top of community events is super important. So tying it back to our core art standards, things that we ask our students to do, we ask them to interpret artistic work for presentation. We ask ourselves, how do we interpret what we're doing as well in our community? How do we interpret the events that we're putting on? How do we perceive and analyze that artistic work? How does our community perceive what we're doing? Are we providing the opportunity for our families to come in and be part of what we're doing? Are we offering our staff the same allotment? Sometimes we do performances during the day, and that can be really hard for families to come and take off work. Sometimes we have these performances where students have to come into the school and it's part of their grade and they have no way to get there because they're watching their younger siblings. So they lose points and then their grade is not great. Do we relate artistic ideas and works with our societal, cultural, and historical context? And every culture, every school building, every society that you're part of is going to be vastly different than the next one. So recognizing the individuals in your school, your students, your staff, your parents, it's so important to make sure that we are continuing to be principal teachers and understand that we are all a team, we are all a community, and we're a central piece of that team and that community. And really, that comes down to, I think this is one that, like, if you only do one thing and have one takeaway, as an evaluator, I look for the community. I look for the one piece where is everybody there? Does everybody have a voice? Is everybody involved? If I see, I mean, think about, you get a happy email from a parent, your principal, that they're like, oh, this music concert was the best one I've ever seen. They're probably going to evaluate you well. They're probably going to praise you for that, right? It doesn't even have to be something that you go all out for. Do we have parents involved? Did we give every student a voice and an opportunity to perform? Did we bring the staff in? The moments that I remember being a performer were where I got to play alongside one of my teachers. I remember I had a recorder ensemble where all of our paraprofessionals had to learn to play the recorder and we surprised the students because they had just been practicing the same thing. Those little moments are going to be the life-changing moments, and that helps us to be more community driven and a better, more principled teacher as well. And I think that's the biggest bang for your buck as an administrator, when you can see everybody coming together. That's the one big thing. So, in culmination of all of this, it's really about finding our why. Why does whatever it is matter to me? How can I show I know it? Domain 1. How can I create the space for others to know it? Domain 2. How can I help others to know it? Domain 3. And how can I learn even more about it? Domain 4. So whatever your fill in the blank is here for why does blank matter to me, think about these 4 questions. And if you're answering all of those, you're going to be in a great place. So for example, why does the knowledge of solfege, let's say we're in an elementary level, the knowledge of solfege matter so much to me? How can I show that I know solfege? There's lots of ways you could probably do that. How can I create space for others to know solfege? How can I help them to know solfege? And then how can I learn even more about it? How can I develop myself in my craft? And that's a very specific one. For me right now, it's why does incorporating more Hispanic music matter to me? Well, it's because a lot of my students are bilingual. A lot of my students come from Spanish speaking only families. How can I show that I know that? Well, I've listened to all my students and what they have to say. I've listened to some of their favorite songs. I've looked at their goals. I've met with their EL teachers. I've met with their dual language teachers. That's how I can show that I know it. I've planned for this. How can I create the space for others to know it? Maybe it's putting out surveys. Maybe in our classroom, I'm using visuals. I'm using the appropriate academic language. I've studied and I've been practicing rolling my R's because I know that's really important. I'm creating that space. How can I help others know it? Maybe we're hanging up QR codes of some of the favorite songs. Maybe in the hallways, between lunch and recess, we're playing some of our students' favorite songs that we're going to be putting on. And then how can I learn even more about it? Continuing to practice my Spanish, continuing to learn about Spanish composers, asking my students, "Oh, have you played this before?" One of my students is in a mariachi band outside of school. Can you send a recording to us so that we can watch it and we can learn how all of these pieces come in place? Find your why and then ask all of those questions within each domain. And that's really the big picture. Again, this is big picture here. Not quite a deep dive, but I really, really appreciate it. I know we're like just perfect with timing. I'm so glad I skipped a couple slides. But please come back next week. This was a very, very, very brief overview. So in our follow-up session, we're going to dive deeper into domains 2 and 3. And those are, the things that you can really see a little bit more of. And that's why it's more important because, as much as we can plan and prepare, unfortunately, our principals aren't going to see that as much off the bat when we're talking about our bang for our buck. So we're going to look at a lesson plan and we're going to look at the activities within the lesson plan and how each domain is addressed within the Danielson model. And if you're come with an activity or lesson plan in mind, because we'll think through all of those lessons and hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about the learning environment and learning experiences domains. And I'm
And
going to stop sharing.
speaking of making your work visible, if you do need a PD certificate, we can help you out with that. I just put the link in the chat. And remember that we do record these sessions, so if you aren't able to make it next week, you can still register, and we will send you out the recording and make this learning available to you. At least, as always, just like right on the money. It's accessible, it's helpful, it's useful, and it was put into language that I had not been familiar with. And so I hope all of you out there enjoyed it as well. If you have questions, you can email Elise directly or come back next week with your lesson plan. And we'll look forward to seeing you then again and at another Music Constructed Professional Development. Elise, thank you so much. Brava.